Today's story starts at the Basilica of St. Apollinaris, near Piazza Navona in central Rome. A very beautiful basilica that holds within it a sense of sacredness, but also silences that go beyond the religious dimension. In the crypt of the Basilica of St. Apollinaris, there is a tomb with a name that is both a symbol of Roman crime and the gray area of power. That name is Enrico de Pedis, known as Renatino, Magliana gang boss, killed on February 2nd, 1990. It's something hard to imagine, a criminal of that stature buried in a basilica of inestimable historical, artistic, and religious value. And from this real and metaphorical point, our story begins. Why in this plot that ties together the Roman underworld, the Vatican, and rogue secret services? Story. De Pedis' parting is one of the most tangled and unsettling knots in Italy's history. Echoing an even greater mystery, the disappearance of Emanuela Orlandi. We've told this story before, and today it returns like a ghost. Our story starts in September 2005. One evening, there's a rather well-known television program called Who Has Seen Them? An anonymous phone call comes in. The voice on the other end of the line talks about the Emanuele Orlandi case. To find the solution to the case, find out who was buried in the Basilica of Santa Apollinari's crypt and the favor Renatino did for Cardinal Pedis. These are heavy words, very strong words, that shake public opinion. People talk about it for days in the newspapers and beyond. From that phone call, the case takes a whole new turn. They're no longer just talking about the disappearance of the girl, a Vatican citizen who vanished into thin air at the beginning of the summer of 1983. There's a web, an increasingly tangled web, that extends to the deceased boss at the Basilica, to the relationships among so many different parties, organized crime, the intelligence services, religion, and power. Judicial investigations would later confirm that there was indeed something uncomfortable in Stato Tomba. But we'll see more about that from here on. First of all, who was Renatino? Actually, Enrico de Pedis, born in Trastevere on May 15, 1954, grew up in a working-class neighborhood. Marked in those years in Rome by poverty and crime, Rome in the post-war period was a city under reconstruction, a reconstruction that also involved the work of the so-called palazzinari, real estate speculators. There, where almost nothing existed, there were hills, wild land, swamps, or areas of extreme decay. New neighborhoods were born there, neighborhoods that were intended as dormitory areas for those who would then go to work in the city center, in the ministries, in the halls of power. But de Pedis was lucky. He wasn't born in Primavalle or on the Nomentana, but in Trastevere. Although it's still central Rome, Trastevere wasn't doing well then either. He grows up in Renatino de Pedis, between Trastevere and Testaccio, where he earns the nickname Renatino. His connection with the Magliana gang is symbolic from the very beginning. He's one of the founding members. Everyone knows that. How did his story begin? Already a robber at a young age, Renatino de Pedis had entrusted a duffel bag full of weapons from his crew. The small group of criminals he associated with to commit crimes included the baker Franco Giuseppucci. The baker had been robbed of this duffel bag while he had gone to have a coffee, and from this theft, he got to know the other founding members of the gang, starting with Maurizio Abatino, Crispino, Giuseppucci, and de Pedis. That's how the Magliana gang was born, a criminal group that made its way in Rome in the second half of the 70s with many violent incidents. The Grazioli kidnapping, the murder of Francino, Ercirminali, the ticket scalper, the war with the Proietti gang, the news. The crime pages of the newspapers, not only in Rome, are filled with the actions of this gang, but it's a very strange gang. Rome had never seen an organization like this before. Of course, there had been the Marseillais, from whose ranks came as an accomplice Danilo Abruciati, the chameleon, another character we've already come across and to whom we've already dedicated one of our stories. Other elements would also arrive. There would be accomplices from the 'Ndrangheta and the Camorra, people who brought with them privileged relationships with big bosses. Let's think of Pippo Collò, the so-called mafia treasurer, but also of the Nuova Camorra Organizzata, the new organized Camorra of Raffaele Cutolo, for the supply of drugs. Renatino de Pedis is one of the leaders of the Magliana. He's one of those who pulls the strings. He's one of those who matters, and matters even more. After the death of Franco Giuseppucci, killed in the feud with the Pedis. After the death of Giuseppucci, the revenge against the Pesciaroli, the gang starts to fall apart. There are two factions, the so-called Pestaccini, led by De Pedis, and the faction of all the others, who become more and more of a minority, that of Abatino. De Pedis wins the feud, but in March 1990, he is killed by two hitmen in Piero Centro, Rome, on Via del Pellegrino. Who sent them is hard to understand, not Abatino, even though the Testaccini tried to make him come back to Rome, even going so far as to kidnap and torture him. His brother. It definitely wasn't some old enemy like the Pedis. They're talking about another man we've already come across in our stories. Enrico Nicoletti, or Erseco if you prefer, the name used by De Cataldo in his crime novel. A strange man, different from the others. Within the gang, a heavyset man, a former carabinier, not particularly fond of firearms, but capable of doing much more within the gang. Another dark legend also surrounded the name Nicoletti, the disappearance of magistrate Paolo Adinolfi, who vanished on July 2, 1994, after leaving his home on Via della Farnesina in Rome. No one knows what happened to Magistrate Adinolfi. Recently, there has been talk of his possible murder and disappearance, with a temporary burial inside an old property belonging to Nicoletti, the House of Jazz. But that's another story that maybe we'll tell you on another occasion. The fact is that going back to De Pedis, in March 1990, his criminal career ended violently. And where is De Pedis buried? In any ordinary cemetery, maybe in the countryside? No, not at Verano. He's not even buried in that crypt, but in the Basilica of Santa Pollinari. It's not a mistake, as Monsignor Piero Vergari, rector of the Basilica, issued a document stating De Pedis made significant contributions to youth, especially for their Christian and human development. A benefactor, a philanthropist? You heard that right. On March 6, 1990, the Vicariate of Rome, through Cardinal Ugo Paletti, gave the authorization for De Pedis to be buried in the crypt, a decision that raises questions. Why? Why grant such a privilege to a boss? And what relationships were established to obtain such a privilege? Very little, almost nothing, is said about that burial until that anonymous phone call that evening in 2005 to Chila Visto, right? Here, potential connections emerge. De Pedis, the Basilica, the disappearance of Emanuela Orlandi. So many events that start to intertwine. The magistrates of the Rome prosecutor's office begin investigations. Because what does that tomb really hide? Let's move forward a few months to 2006. One of the few informants from the gang, Antonio Mancini, Acatoni, as he was nicknamed, claims to have recognized the voice of the caller from Cilavisto. It would be Ruffetto, that's the nickname, a man connected to De Pedis, a killer. The gang refers to him as Antonio Mancini. The situation becomes even more disturbing over the years, with repeated inspections of the crypt, requests for access from directors, and even parliamentary inquiries. Why does the case of Emanuele Orlandi keep resurfacing? It's not just because the girl never came home, but because we've already seen all those cover-ups. In the video dedicated to her, they left their mark among the unanswered questions. Among the most disturbing leads is the one suggesting that the Magliana gang, and in particular Renatino, may have played a role in the kidnapping. So let's go back to the show Who Has Seen It? But this time, in July 2008, the show aired part of an interview with Sabrina Minardi. A woman who had been with De Pedis claims that Emanuela was held prisoner in an apartment on Via Antonio Pignatelli and that De Pedis had shown her to her. 2 bags with corpses thrown into a cement mixer on the coast in Torvaianica. What does Sabrina Minardi say? Is it true? Is she lying? Does she want to shed light on the case? Does she finally want to come clean? Or is she just rambling or worse, misleading? The investigations are inconclusive. The bodies are missing. Evidence is lacking. So a trial can't occur and the full truth can't be revealed. But the connection with Pedis's tomb seems to be a key to a deeper interpretation. In fact, in 2010, the Vicariate of Rome gave permission to inspect Pedis's tomb. We have to wait 2 years. In May 2012, the tomb is finally opened next to Pedis's recognized coffin. A box containing Napoleonic-era bones from the late 1700s to early 1800s was found, but nothing connects them to Emanuela Orlandi. Pedis's remains are later moved, cremated, and his ashes are scattered at sea. But why all this? So let's try to imagine. Maybe the tomb acted like a mirror. It just reflected many of the Italian ambiguities. A long-buried boss in a sacred site, linked to churches and politics. A mysterious disappearance that appears to span beyond national borders. Then with a phone call that acts like a bomb detonator, highlighting an anomaly and pushing investigators to do their duty after a long silence. But what was that favor? By retrieving, in fact, the transcript of the phone call that Pedis supposedly made to Cardinal Paletti, who at the time was the Vicar General of the Diocese of Rome, that's where the suspicion lies. The clearance for the burial, the role of the Church. Very ambiguous because approving the burial of a member is a criminal world. Some accounts claim the Banda della Magliana allegedly helped resolve a financial dispute between the Vatican and the bankrupt Banco Ambrosiano. Another case that puts the Banda della Magliana at the center. We've already seen this. Danilo Abrucciati is killed by gunshots from a night watchman while fleeing after shooting someone in the leg. Roberto Rossoni, vice president of Banco Ambrosiano. It's 1982. The gang is at the peak of its power, and Banco Ambrosiano is going bankrupt. It goes bankrupt due to a complex web of stories, events, and characters. There's P2, there's Michelle Sindona, there's Jelly, and of course there's Roberto Calvi, who will be found dead, hanging from scaffolding under the Fratineri Bridge in London. There's his secretary, Graziella Corrocher, who falls allegedly by suicide from the headquarters of Banco Ambrosiano the day before Calvi's body is found. There's the multi-billion collapse. So, did the Banda della Magliana facilitate something in this affair? Getting that compensation for Pedis in return? A prominent burial inside the Basilica. That burial had become a symbol. The criminal underworld managing to enter even inside the Catholic Church. The Banda della Magliana, in addition to drug trafficking and racketeering, had connections with the Sicilian Mafia. Consider Mario Agliaroro, a.k.a. Alias, and Pippo Collò, the Mafia's cashier in Rome for years, connected to the P2 Lodge and parts of the state. Think about the so-called Super Sismi di Pazienza, a parallel structure that has been talked about many times. Renatino de Pedis skillfully navigated these murky waters, becoming a powerful and feared interlocutor for many. This context makes it easier to understand why his burial and the circumstances surrounding it became the subject of investigation, even if belatedly. Not only a serious anomaly, but also a key to accessing the networks that connect economic power, criminal power, and institutional power. But then let's go back to the reason for that burial, because here we can hypothesize that the burial might have been part of that contract. A pact with the devil? Pedis might have guaranteed some unspeakable favors to the Vatican or to someone connected to those circles. And the Basilica, as a burial place, would have been a tangible sign of an unspeakable reward. Or maybe the tomb as a symbol of cover-up. There's the theory that the tomb prevented or slowed down investigations into the Orlandi case, serving as a way to silence the most sensitive issues. And the phone call. The phone call is a kind of warning. The anonymous call worked as a way to disturb or put pressure. If you want the truth, go take a look. There, a series of checks began that just a few years before seemed unthinkable or unnecessary. The Orlandi Magliana Vatican Trail. If the Magliana gang played a role in the kidnapping of Emanuela, then the presence of Pedis in the Basilica takes on a new meaning. Not just favors, but complicity, silence, collusion. From Latin connivere, meaning to close one's eyes. Many questions remain, so let's ask them ourselves. Why did the Basilica of Santa Apollinare and the Vicariate of Rome approve Pedis's burial? What criteria or pressures influenced their decision? What exactly did Rector Vergari's letter of attestation contain, the one that described Pedis as a great benefactor of Roman society? Yes, the tomb was opened, the remains were analyzed, and nothing foreign was found. But why was that period of time allowed to pass? Significant delays occurred between the phone call, Vatican approval, and the opening in 2005, 2010, and 2012. There was also an investigative authority. And all this? The disappearance of poor Emanuela. How much weight did Sabrina Melardi's statements carry? And finally, to what extent? The presence of Pedis in the Basilica is a symbol of a system that allowed criminal infiltration into religious, civil, and state institutions. These are all questions that deserve answers, but we don't have them. The story of Renatino, from Testaccio to his burial in the Basilica, goes beyond simple crime reporting. It exemplifies an Italy infiltrated by illegality and a church that becomes a site for Roman crime, which extends beyond racketeering into the halls of power, and the anonymous call to Who Has Seen It program. It brought out the fact that behind a disappearance, that of Emanuela Orlandi, there could be a much broader story, a story made of silences, of abetting, of agreements, complicity. Renatino's tomb, there, in that basilica, was a physical focal point, a disturbing metaphor for when the line between good and evil, the church and the mafia, or the police and power, becomes nearly invisible. And today, as we analyze new pieces of that intricate puzzle that was the Magliana, though we continue to seek the truth behind many high-profile crimes, disappearances, and mysteries, one warning remains: the truth is still distant. It is often said that silence has many doors, and perhaps one of those doors is one of the heaviest and most difficult to open. For a long time, it was there, near Piazza Navona, at the Basilica of Santa Apollinare.